All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the webinar. We're going to get started in just a moment. Before we do, we always like to review webinar procedures, let folks know how this will function. And for those of you that maybe have not joined us in a while, we are using a new webinar tool called Zoom. Hopefully some of you are familiar with it. It's very similar to the GoToWebinar that we had previously used. So to quickly start off here, I do want to ask for your participation in providing us feedback and make sure that our signal is reaching everyone. To do that, I want you to find the Q&A button on your Zoom interface and have you click that. And if you can hear me right now and it's a good clear signal, just type a Y, a yes, I can hear you, hello, anything like that into that box. And that'll let us know things are proceeding well so far. First page of our PowerPoint presentation should also be viewable upon your screen. If at any point throughout the course of the webinar you experience audio problems or any other technical problems, again, please use that Q&A box to let us know. We'll attempt to take care of anything that should come up. But it looks like we are good to go. I appreciate all the feedback on the audio test. So I'm going to step aside and we will get this webinar underway.
Well, welcome everyone. We appreciate you taking this afternoon and join Antone and myself for this webinar looking at the ESHB 2224. And we know there's been long anticipated some kind of Q&A and ability to ask some questions around this House bill. And so we just want to point you to a couple things. One, the question box, that is where you can, as we go through the webinar, type in any questions you would like throughout the webinar, and we will have times where we can stop and actually answer those questions. Any questions that we don't get to, then we will put those in an FAQ. Just want to let you know that the webinar recording and all the documents that we will reference today will actually be posted on this web page listed on the front page. So I'm Ann Gallagher, I'm the Director of Mathematics.
I'm Antone Jackson, Director of Assessment Development. And I want to welcome you and then talk just a little bit about what topics we're going to cover today, some commonly asked questions, answer those that are part of FAQs, look a little bit at the 10th grade assessment, talk about supports for locally determined courses, including the Bridge to College in third credit of math, and then talk a little bit about alternative assessments with a nod to some work we're doing with collection of evidence tasks.
So we just wanted to start with a quick overview of the different sections of the House Bill 2224. We will not cover all of these, but the main components of the bill focused on eliminating COE and adding an expedited appeals waiver for the class of 2014 through 2018. It also talks about locally determined courses, which is what the LDC stands for, and locally administered assessments, which is the LAA. Dual credit as an alternative assessment, and the Bridge to College course. It talks about the Smarter Bounce moving to grade 10, the high school and beyond plan as it begins in 7th or 8th grade, interventions and supports around supporting students who aren't on track by the end of 10th grade, and then they postpone the graduation requirement for the science assessment.
Okay, so looking at some common questions, and again, as Ann mentioned, want to put anything that comes along as you're thinking about it in that Q&A box, and we will take some time, a couple times during the presentation, to answer some of those. But hopefully, some of these are some of laying the groundwork, and some of it is some new information that we wanted to share with you, hot off the presses, actually, for today. So, one of the questions that we get frequently is about students that should take the Smarter Balanced assessment. So for this year, in spring 2018, 10th graders will take it, and some 11th graders will take the assessment in the spring. The 10th graders who are in the class of 2020 will take it for federal accountability, so that is their that federal accountability. It also meets a graduation requirement currently under legislation. The 11th graders who are in a class of 2019 should take the assessment if they didn't take it last year. We know that for ELA, for example, there are a lot of 10th graders who took the Smarter Balance test in spring last year. They don't have to take the test again this year if they took it last year. there were a smaller number of students in math who took the high school assessment as 10th graders last year. Those students do not have to retest. The only thing we're looking at is 11th graders in the class of 2019 who didn't test last year as 10th graders. They should be taking it for purposes of high school graduation requirements. They do have currently a graduation testing requirement, and this Smart Balance meets that graduation requirement. If there are students who did test last year as 10th graders but didn't achieve the graduation cut score, those students should also test again in spring. Again, the purpose is for them to meet the graduation requirements. So if they tested as 10th graders and didn't quite make it up to that cut score, they should be testing again this spring for that purpose. So will the test in spring be the same as previous years? We know it's being transitioned to 10th grade. So what's the difference that we're going to see? And the biggest difference is the fact that for math, we're looking at attending to the fact that most students are only going to have had 2 years of math instruction at the high school level by the end of their 10th grade year. So we want to have an assessment appropriate for them that attends to that and looks at content that was introduced during those first 2 years. We've worked with educator groups within Washington State to identify content that would be exclusively introduced in a third-year course or even in a fourth-year course. Sometimes students are taking 3 or 4 years of instruction aligned to the standards, and that's either one. That's perfectly fine. So we want to make sure that we have an assessment that's appropriate, and we are going to talk a little bit more about go in a little bit more detail later on in the webinar about what specific things we can share with you, because as I said, there are some very recent developments, but this kind of just laying that groundwork and saying, yes, there are going to be some changes for the math assessment.
And one question I get frequently is, is there going to be a new blueprint or a new test map? So
yeah, absolutely. So we've just finalized some documentation that it talks to that. We should have it up and posted by the end of the week. But essentially, no, there's not a plan for having a new blueprint for either math or ELA. There are a few reasons for that. For math, we've got a pretty robust bank that allows the test to be adaptive, and so we can remove items with content that's exclusively introduced in the third-year course and still have enough to adapt to student performance and measure students a variety of performance levels. So kind of sneak peek, yeah, there is not a plan to have a new blueprint for the 10th grade test. Many of you probably likely heard last week the State Board of Education adopted new cut scores. So this information is new to our website by hopefully again by the end of the week. If you've been on the State Board website, you would have seen these numbers already. But the State Board adopted what we're calling on track to career and college ready cut scores. So these are cut scores for the 10th grade assessment. So the question about, well, will these cut scores be for 10th graders in the class of 2020 and 11th graders in the class of 2019? Yes, these are the cut scores for the assessment, with the level 3 being the on track to career and college ready by the end of their high school experience, understanding they're going to do some more things in their junior and senior year. So both the ELA and the math are listed here. The other cut score that's often a question is about the graduation cut score I mentioned a little bit earlier. The State Board did not take any action on changing those cut scores, so they're going to stay the same as they have for the past few years, specifically 2595 for math. So that kind of fits right in between that level 2 and level 3 cut scores as it has in the past. So we have a link on this particular page. Many of you have seen this on graduation alternatives, eligibility, who's eligible to take the assessment. Again, we're looking at 10th graders for this spring taking the assessment, some 11th graders. There may even be some 12th graders who would want to take the assessment in the spring based on meeting a graduation requirement. But this link here with the graduation alternatives eligibility goes into more detail about that. And yes, students do need to take the Smarter Balanced assessment at least once if they want access to alternatives assessments such as the SAT, the ACT, the dual credit, etc. Those options. As Anne asked, already will new test blueprint, we're saying if there is a new one, I think this is the language we have on the FAQ now, but we're looking to update that within the next couple of days so that we can say no, there aren't the blueprint that we've had used previously, we're going to continue to use for 10th grade testing. As Anne mentioned in the overview of the bill, the collection of evidence is no longer an option, so we were not administering that assessment anymore. We are looking at relationships with collection of evidence for alternative assessments, whether that means locally administered assessments, locally determined courses. Those are some thoughts, but nothing has been fleshed out now. But we hope to have more information about both the locally administered assessments and locally determined courses by the end of January, again on that House Bill 2224 webpage. And again, the link is here on this particular slide.
So one of the questions that we get a lot, excuse me, is Bridge to College. What about Bridge to College? So Bridge to College was called out in the bill as an approved alternative to the assessment graduation requirement. And so in terms of a locally determined course and locally administered assessment, as an alternative to if they don't pass the Smarter Bounds, that this is an appropriate course and it's all been approved. With a caveat that, the big question is, can juniors take the Bridge to College course? And there's been some questions about, well, could we just teach this course for our juniors right after the 10th grade year? And really, this course, the way it was designed, is for seniors. The agreement is based on taking this course in their senior year to be able to access an agreement to enter into credit-bearing courses. And so right now, we are working to maintain that placement agreement, and but the other piece we'll talk about later on is an alternative assessment for graduation requirement. Or possible supports for the locally determined courses is a 3rd credit of math, which would be really appropriate for students who are juniors.
I want to dive a little bit into some more specific details about the 10th grade assessment and give a little sneak peek to some documents that we're going to be posting, as I said, later on this week. Again, we'll be posting those to the same, making to that FAQ that is, I think, has been the same since October of last year. So, get that information out to folks so they can have the same level of information. But again, we had the legislation that said, okay, we want to shift to testing in 10th grade for math and ELA in the high school. And so in the fall, we worked with groups of educators to look at what content is appropriate for an expectation of testing at the end of 10th grade. We looked primarily at the standards and said, what are those that standards as content that would be unique to and first introduced in the 3rd year or subsequent years. And then we worked with other groups of educators to look at more specific, smarter balanced test information, specifically the item specifications, to say, is there a more fine grain of detail that we can get to within certain standards and say, okay, we're still going to have parts of a standard or entry into a particular standard eligible or included in a 10th grade assessment, but other parts would not be included. So we did a lot of work with the educators. We had communication with Smarter Balanced, and they worked with educators to talk about expectations for 10th grade students. We worked with our test vendor and made sure that we would have a reliable and valid test available for kids in 10th grade if we did make those particular changes to the content of the test that students see in 10th grade.
And we'll note at the bottom, go back to that slide real quick, at the bottom of the slide, these documents that we're referring to during this section of the webinar will be posted. That will provide the link to the webpage that will be posted. We're hoping by the end of the week, hopefully sooner than later, but though that's where you will find all of these documents that Anton will be referring to.
Thank you. So one note that we want to make sure that we attend to, and I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is the fact that students should be receiving instruction toward the entirety of the high school standards throughout their high school experience, and that typically is going to take 3 or 4 years of instruction. So yes, we're going to have identified standards that will be included on the assessment for 10th grade, but we want to make sure that, again, we're attending to the instruction. We want to make sure that that good instruction is occurring, that the pathways that students are taking give them opportunities to receive that instruction and to grow in learning toward the high school standards as they exist in their entirety, including the mathematical practices, including the modeling domain. That is an integral component of the sequence of courses that students would see in their high school experience. We've just kind of narrowed the field for the fact that we're saying, okay, at the end of 10th grade, they may not have gotten there to everything. So what's reasonable, what's appropriate for assessing at that point.
Yeah, and I think appreciate that lens, and that we, see that this assessment is really just a metric that we can hopefully help to see to what degree students are on track by the end of 10th grade. And it's really about what is that learning that they need to continue to engage in, not only to continue to bring them on track towards career and college readiness, but through hopefully their 4 years of their math education, and really those pathways they have around mathematics. And that really encompasses all of the standards.
Yeah, and we look at the assessment as just one of those measures of where a student is going, and you have to take into account the high school and beyond plan, their post K-12 aspirations. What are we preparing students to do? This is just one kind of touchstone at that point in 10th grade. And if they are level 3, level 4, what are we doing to advance those students' learning as well? Okay, so what we've done is taken...
big question.
Yeah, the big question. What is the content on the test? So what I've done in a document is taken the high school standards and highlighted those standards and areas, the clusters, the domains, the math practices, those pieces that are that would be included in an assessment for 10th grade starting in spring of 2018. And as is mentioned here, the standards for mathematical practice are included in everything. Anything that's highlighted would be eligible for assessment in claims 2, 3, and 4. We got a little bit more specific information that we can provide for claim 1 based on educator input. But one of the documents, basically that's all it does, is it takes the high school standards and says, okay, if this is what we expect over 3 or 4 years, what might we expect over the first 2 years at the end of 10th grade? So to give you a little sneak peek of that, what that might look like is, for example, we'll go through all of the conceptual categories here, but like in number and quantity, we're looking at 2 particular areas in number and quantity that would be included in the 10th grade assessment. These are areas that have been introduced to students, that students should have some understanding of through the first 2 years of high school. You may build on this, you may extend on this into a 3rd or 4th year course, but they should know some of this. They should have some introduction into these areas within those up through those first 2 years of high school, even into some things like 8th grade, understanding about exponents and using properties of exponents. They're introduced to some of that in the 8th grade standards. So this high school naturally builds on that. In algebra, here's another area that, okay, this is going to be a big component of what they do maybe in their 9th grade or in their first year of high school math. Again, a lot of this content is introduced within that first year, and there are some things that you can see the three bullets here on the left-hand side and the bottom that are not highlighted. So these are things that are likely not introduced based on teacher input within that first 2 years. So we would not include that within the assessment. So this overview page that you see in the standards has these sections highlighted to say, hey, here's the areas you can go to get a little bit more information about testing in 10th grade. And then to give you a little bit of a deeper dive, in this case here, we look at, okay, we are going to assess polynomials and operations with polynomials. So they've been introduced to how things get added together, and when you can add terms together, and what happens when you multiply different expressions. So that is something that is introduced, and at this deeper dive level, you can see it is the entirety of that particular cluster of standards is something that would be eligible, that could be included on the 10th grade assessment. If we then move into functions, again, functions, there are particular areas in this one, specifically trigonometric functions are not included on the assessment for 10th grade. This is something likely introduced in that 3rd or 4th year course. But the other aspects of working with functions, understanding what a function is, dealing with linear, quadratic, and exponential models, those are things that they should be introduced to in the first 2 years of high school math. And then the same thing with geometry. Quite a bit of the geometry within first 2 years. There are some notable exceptions. Again, trigonometry to general triangles. If we're not going to do trigonometry in functions, we're not going to do it in geometry in terms of a function. They are going to be doing this in terms of ratios of side lengths. And then some work with circles. They're going to get an introduction to the work with circles, but not extend through all of the content within that aspect of working with circles. Give you a sense of sometimes when there are bits and pieces of a cluster identified as eligible for assessment in the 10th grade. So for example, we've got here in this first cluster under the properties, geometry and properties with equations, looking at the equation for a circle using the Pythagorean theorem. They've been working with Pythagorean theorem since 8th grade, so should be able to do that. Completing the square is something they work with in the work with quadratics, so there's natural connections there. But we're not going to have them do standard number 2. We're not going to deal with equations for parabola. We're not going. That's something that that would have been included in the 11th grade assessment, but isn't included because just was one of the content areas identified as not typical of what students would see within the first 2 years. And then we have a plus standard as well that's included in this cluster, and that plus standard, you'll see throughout the document, plus standards are not included as content that would be assessed at the end of 10th grade. So you get into that deeper dive, you can kind of see, get an overview from the different area, and then get into the different specific standards. And again, as I said, this full document will be posted on that website. And then finally, statistics and probability. Again, we're going to be doing some probability, looking at categorical and quantitative data, looking at an introduction to conditional probability with an understanding of what independence and conditional probability are, using them to interpret data. So kind of an introduction. I think statistics and probability, more so than any other content, is one that seems to be peppered throughout the 3 or 4 years of instruction that students receive. So this was the educator's recommendations as far as what would be for sure or most appropriate to include on that assessment after the first 2 years. And again, a little bit deeper dive into even what we mean by categorical and quantitative data. It's not everything within that, within all of that particular content area. So again, some standards, some parts of standards included, and others are not. So in addition to that document around the standards, we have another document that's called the Mathematics Testing Further Focus, and this gives us a little bit more information about particular standards and where is the assessment going to focus. So there are some standards that talk about functions, but don't necessarily say what types of functions. And there are many, many types of functions that students could work with. So for example, we've got in the table that we have here, a standard listed on the left that says, okay, there's an algebra in seeing structure. There's a particular standard that deals with functions. On the assessment for 10th grade, the functions that students should have seen and should be familiar with when dealing with the content of that ASSE .2 standard are linear, quadratic, exponential, and polynomial. So that is the focus of that assessment, and that's where we think those are the types of functions that educators recommended would be appropriate for students to have seen and experience and be familiar with through that first 2 years of high school. Then we've got linear, quadratic, and exponential functions as the focus for a whole slew of other standards within algebra, functions, and statistics. And then even further down, one of them in the one additional standard where we're just looking at linear and quadratic. So one note that we have here is that some of these standards are assessed in Claim 1. And so any restrictions that we would place here on the standard itself would also be placed on any content, any items that are meant to assess Claim 1, which is your concepts and procedures. But then we went, and as I said, we looked at the Claim 1 task models, and we said, well, what are the things that are appropriate for those task models? And so even further focus and say, okay, there are specific targets aligned to specific standards or sets of standards, and there are specific task models to describe ways that we're going to assess the concepts and procedures of that particular standard. And some of those task models, again, are very broad, and they would allow any or many types of functions. We're going to focus that down. We're going to say for 10th grade, for the end of 2 years, linear, quadratic, and exponential for these particular task models are going to be the focus. So as with these task models and the standards on this particular page, if there is no restriction, if there's no information about further focus of the function, then there wasn't any restriction placed on that for the assessment. For example, solving systems of equations. Students learn very early that linear system of equations, graphically, you look at it, where do the two lines intersect? That's the solution to the system of linear equations. They use the same reasoning for systems of nonlinear equations. Look at the graph, where do they intersect? Those are the solutions. So that concept that they're introduced to in a first up through the first 2 years is something that we say, okay, we don't necessarily need to limit to just linear systems of equations. If they're solving it graphically, it could be anything, because they're introduced to that concept within those first 2 years. So those are the ones where we're saying here are ones where we do feel we need to limit it to be appropriate for 10th grade. And then even further, we look at all of the task models, all of the targets, and say, well, are there specific task models within the targets, again, that we would focus on? And again, there's some interplay here that if this, like for example, target D assesses a standard that's identified in the previous table, well then we're going to limit the content of anything that assesses anything in target D based on those focus. So just trying to give some information about how are we trying to focus and kind of peel off and identify those things that are first introduced in the 3rd or 4th year of high school math, and say let's not assess those. Let's really try and focus the work that we're doing. So it's appropriate for the end of 2 years of high school instruction. So yeah, these are little snippets taken out of a larger document that goes in a little bit more detail, kind of as I described, and as I said, will be posted along with the standards document on that FAQ website. So I think we've been getting some questions along the way.
We have. We've been getting some questions. I've answered a few, but some I've waited to answer out loud. So the first one is, will the SBA interim assessments be tweaked to align to the new test, meaning the focus will be on Algebra 1 and Geometry?
Yeah. Unfortunately, the interim assessments won't be modified because they are meant to be something that we can use consortium-wide. There is work, though, being done to narrow the focus of each of the interims. So instead of having an interim that is just algebra, linear functions, or statistics, they're going to try to limit, to narrow the focus, so you would have, say, multiple interims around statistics, and we may then go in and look at and say, okay, well, what are the interims that would align with the content that we're assessing in the end of 10th grade, and maybe make some suggestions. Say, hey, here are some ones you might want to include in first 2 years of high school because they align with the assessment. But the interim assessments are really about getting information about instruction. And so wherever we end up assessing, the interims are really designed to give information about how do you know where students are in their learning toward the standards, how do you move that learning forward, somewhat independent of the summative assessment, if you think about the interim blocks.
Yeah, and you can really, pull out those pieces of the interim blocks that really focus on Algebra 1 and geometry.
Yep, yep.
Okay, another question. How do the content changes work for integrated classes? Integrated 1 and 2 are not equivalent to Algebra 1 and geometry.
Correct. So we had a lot of conversations about this, and we included educators who taught both algebra, geometry, algebra 2, and those who taught integrated sequences in the conversation. And so really what we try to do is boil down what is the overlap, what is that commonality of content that students would see within the first 2 years, regardless of the sequence of courses that they would take. It's likely that there may need to be some revisiting of that sequencing based on the instruction, but based on what's part of the assessment. But again, the idea being that this is just one point along the sequence of instruction that students are receiving about the entirety of the standard. So we've got we had educators involved in the conversation who had experience with both types of sequences to give us input and come to some final decisions.
All right, and we've been getting a lot of questions about when this will be posted. And so what I did, we will post all of these documents, the PowerPoint, the webinar recording on our the FAQ page of House Bill 2224. And I just, in the Q&A, I put the link to that page. So go there, bookmark it, and keep watching in the next couple of days to see when those are posted, and then you'll have access to all of these documents, as well as the webinar and the PowerPoint. So another question, will this mean new item specs published specific to Washington State? No.
So I think what we've done is, in looking at the item specifications, we've narrowed the focus. So in this, for example, this table here, we said, okay, these are for the claim 1, where we can get very specific, and we say this item, if it's written to task model 1A, it looks like this, and it assesses this skill. We're narrowing some of that focus, but we're not going to create new item specifications because the item specifications are smarter balanced documents. We're still in smarter balanced state.
So I think one way to look at it is there's really nothing changing around the smarter balance,
right,
except we are just removing items from the bank,
right,
and that will be. So.
Exactly.
Okay, so we have another couple questions around the actual content. So which year of curriculum includes rational exponents? So I think the question is, we noticed rational exponents. How did that get a decision to be included, if I am interpreting that correctly?
Yeah, so likely it's introduced in an Algebra or Integrated 1 or Integrated 2 course. But it really is up to decisions at the local level as to when particular content is introduced based on the pathways, based on the sequences of 3 or 4 courses that students typically take, where you would introduce it. I think that is a local decision, and it's going to be different from area to area, but I would say typically Algebra 1 or integrated 1 or integrated 2.
So and yeah, so it sounds like the committee made the decision to, like, they saw that introduced in one of those 2 courses,
yeah,
which is why it's included in the.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Another one about content. It says, so we're a little bit confused actually. G, GPE, and GC are not assessed on SBA. There's not a target associated with them, nor are they assessed at any of the other claims. I thought we were taking things out of the SBA. Are we adding things? So
yeah,
kind of confused there.
That's a common misconception when we look at the standards, especially in geometry, to say, oh, they're not assessed in the smarter balance. Everything in the high school standards is eligible to be assessed in claims 2, 3, and 4. There are areas of focus within those claims to say, yeah, there are standards that lend themselves well. Geometry is one in content in particular that lends itself well to claim 3, and the reasoning and the communication. And there are areas of focus within geometry that are of would make up, say, 80% of the items that are in the bank for that particular claim or that particular skill. Really, it's the math practices we're trying to get at. We're using the content in geometry to get at deeply at the math practices and kind of blend the two of those together. But geometry content is included in assessments of the Smarter Balance in 11th grade. It's eligible at all for claims 2, 3, and 4. I think you're right when we talk about it as it's not part of claim 1. There's only one area in geometry that's assessed in claim 1, and only one area in statistics that's assessed in claim 1. But everything is eligible for assessment when we look at the claims 2, 3, and 4 and applying math practices.
So I think one of the questions too, like in terms of circles, what could you clarify what would be covered, like what would be an example of something be covered around circles that is part of the item specs?
Yeah, I can. I don't have the circles. I can probably answer that in the FAQ. I think. Okay. Yeah, I'll answer that in the FAQ just because I don't have. Here we say, okay, there's one part of the standards around circles that we would assess. There's another part that we would not, and I think this has to do with the idea of what is that just an example of what is that intersection between the integrated sequence that students would see, where they may not get to introducing pieces around in geometry and also in statistics. This is another area where we have a large section out of the standards because the recommendations for the teachers were, if you were looking at that overlap of algebra, the traditional algebra, geometry, algebra 2 sequence and your integrated sequences, there are some things that aren't introduced until a third year in either one of those sequences.
Okay, all right. Next one is, does exponential further devolve into growth only versus growth or decay?
There's not at this time a distinction between growth and decay for exponential. This is one, I think, something that occurred when we transitioned to the standards in 2011 was we used to say, oh yeah, we're only going to assess exponential growth, but with the Common Core standards, they don't differentiate between growth or decay. Students should be familiar with exponential functions and how the different values are going to impact, say, the graph or the function, and so they're introduced to exponentials, not necessarily saying, oh, we're only going to deal with exponentials in a growth model, and then later on we're going to introduce them in a decay model. That's not that didn't seem the intent of the standards, and didn't seem to be something that the educators were concerned about in terms of their recommendations.
Okay. Another question about content. So about ASSE2, what would be the focus of polynomial functions? Algebra 1 tends to focus on linear, quadratic, and exponential.
Writing expressions in equivalent form. So in terms of polynomials, really what we want to do is we want to be able to know is, can a student use properties of algebra to rewrite a polynomial expression in a different form, and I think that was that's the focus here. We have ASSE. I have I think ASSE 1 is just interpreting structure, and ASSE 2 is the writing expressions. Okay.
Can you verify the source of items on the IABs, the intern assessment banks blocks? Are these retired items from the SBA? Are they rejected? Are they completely sample items, separately written items?
That's a good question. So yeah, these are items that went through the same process as items that appear on the summative assessment. Interim items have all of the data associated with student responses, so they were field tested. For reasons of meeting content with the interim blocks, they were selected out of the summative bank to create the interim blocks. They were selected as a group to represent a variety of difficulty, of item type, of skill, of claim, and weren't looked at for the fact that, oh, they've been used, a dozen times, or they weren't looked at the fact that, how they performed in terms of were they good items bad items. So yeah, often the thought is, oh, well, these are rejected items, these are things, and that's just not the case. These are as high a quality of items in the interims as they are in the summative assessment.
Okay. And then one question, will the members of the 9th grade class of 2021 who are taking advanced courses be able to take the test this spring? So at this point, we don't have a definitive answer for that. It's still
I think coming back to the question about who's eligible to take the 10th grade the Smarter Balance assessment, and then who is which students should take the Smarter Balance assessment. I think you're right. You're saying 10th graders should take it, some 11th graders, some 12th graders. Those are the students who should.
And kind of keep in mind that they did, provide the opportunity for students to take it in 10th grade from 11th grade, and a lot of that was because ELA was already taking the assessment in 10th grade. So that's kind of some background around kind of that move and the decisions there.
Right, and we had a much smaller number of students testing math in 10th grade than ELA.
Right. So there's a couple other questions. We're either going to get to them. Let's see, there's one more. So if 10th grade students earn a new level 3 cut score on the SBA F2614, does that mean they're finished and does not need to retake the math SBA exam again?
Yes.
Yep, they're done.
Yeah, same thing if they meet the if they meet the graduation cut score, the 2595, they're done.
Okay, and then will there be an altered form of the online interim assessments anytime soon that meets the new standard levels? So again, I think we talked about this, that really these interim assessments are about thinking about the learning and how it just supports instructional practices versus really aligning specifically to the SBA. I mean, clearly the items are similar, but
yeah, and if you've seen the reports for the interim blocks, they don't say, well, this is the cut score that you've got. They're very broad.
Right,
in some cases, it's difficult to make an assertion, but you get this at or near standard. So the numbers aren't that, they're not so far away that at or near standard isn't still going to mean at or near standard. But because that's a really broad category.
Yeah. All right, so we're going to move on to the next part of this webinar, which is supports for locally determined courses. So what in the bill this really talked about is an alternative to students having to pass the Smarter Bounce, saying, we feel like districts can determine a course that could be used in place of actually passing the Smarter Bounce. So you have to take the assessment at least once, and if students don't pass assessment, then they have an option for a locally determined course. Now again, the guidance around this and more information will be coming out by the end of January, but I would just want to talk about what are some actual supports for thinking about locally determined courses. So first of all, we did already talk about, but Bridge to College is in the bill already approved as a locally determined course, and the embedded assessments are already approved. There are the requirements for using Bridge to College. They continue to remain. That does not change at all. It is designed for 12th graders. Teachers who are teaching the course for the first time must attend professional development to teach the course. That is a requirement. And they must use the course code, the Bridge to College course code. The audience for Bridge to College are seniors who are really interested in college, and they just need a little extra to ensure success that in credit-bearing math courses once they get to college. Again, the work group is convening to determine any adjustments to the placement agreement and in light of moving the SBA to 10th grade. And there's a link there to the Bridge to College. There are all the materials that are available there. You are welcome to use those, use a subset of those as you think about your locally determined courses. So the third credit of math, this is something that we know has always been a need, and particularly as we have started the Bridge to College initiative, folks were saying, well, what about the students who maybe score a 1, or can I put my juniors in there? And we're always trying to say this really is a subset of students who are looking at college. But the Bridge to College has been very successful in terms of students really having some shifts in the way they see themselves, excuse me, as mathematicians, and engaging in the mathematics and feeling success around the mathematics, being able to reason, and in teachers teaching it. Students say, I love this class. It's my favorite class, and teachers who are very excited about the teaching approaches and really digging into supporting students around discourse and reasoning. So as we know, we're thinking about how can we best support districts and schools in these locally determined courses. What we've decided is we brought together a group of educators that will be meeting this year to design a third credit of math course that is actually going to be initially starting with a subset of the Bridge to College materials. So this is, we'll call this, it's the Washington Math Advisory Council. And, excuse me, the focus will be for those 11th grade students that aren't quite on track for career, on track by the end of 10th grade. And really looking at designing this course is how to really support those gaps that students might come away from in 10th grade and bring them on a, fill those gaps and in a way that really engages them in reasoning and maybe some different experiences around the mathematics that we know have been successful with the Bridge to College. And then the hope is that they now have many more doors that are open to them instead of having to repeat courses, that now they have an opportunity that they could, their senior year, take a Bridge to College course, or maybe possibly they are ready to take Algebra 2, or they might want to take a CTE equivalency course, or possibly, looking at computer science. There could be many different options. So this work is moving forward. The timeline is we have some funding and through June 30th. So this advisory group will meet 6 times, and really thinking about what is the content of this course, and thinking very, what is the important standards and the content, in a way that they can narrow that to go very deep. So students have an opportunity to really dig deeply into the standards, into the mathematics. Our aim and our hope is to have this course ready so districts can offer it in the fall, as well as having opportunities for professional development online and possibly face-to-face. It could be something that we parallel along with the Bridge to College, the professional development that's offered often in first part of August. That would require a little bit of funding, but this course, there would not be requirements for teachers to attend professional development, but it is really strongly encouraged. And one of the ways we want to support districts and schools in doing that is to have some online opportunities to engage in the professional development. So we just want you to know that this is a big part of the work in the next few months, and we will continue to keep you posted. If you haven't signed up for Gov Delivery for Math, please do that. It's just an email kind of newsletter that we try and keep you updated every couple of weeks, and we will always put the most up-to-date information about this third credit of math. So I'll let Antone speak to this one.
So I mentioned this earlier, the collection of evidence tasks. We are looking at using some of those to support an alternative assessment, because we know that these are aligned well to the standards. They, as Anne described in the Bridge to College, they are engaging and in contexts that are interesting to students. So we want to be able to do that. So that is why we've not released any COE tasks for classroom use. That question has come up a couple times, so I wanted to attend to that. So there were a few questions.
All right.
Yeah.
Let me get down here. So one quick question was 11th grade test the same as last year. So I think we've talked a lot about what will be on the test. So the spring, what was given in the fall is 11th grade Smarter Balance, and what will be given in the spring is the 10th grade Smarter Balance with those items removed. So what is the minimum grade that needs to be earned for Bridge to College to qualify for the alternative in meeting the grad requirement? Is that minimum grade needed for both semesters or only second semester? So I want to distinguish two things here. So for Bridge to College, if you are using this as an alternative assessment, alternative to the assessment, it is a local decision of what that passing will be. And so that is really determined locally. However, for the placement agreement, it is a B in terms of being able to place into credit-bearing courses once they go to college. And that threshold is they need to get a B out of the course. Since it is, since it is a locally determined course, does that mean that a district can design a class and get it approved to be a locally determined course, or can we only pick from that OSP has built? So because you're right, it is locally determined, it is up to the districts to determine what courses they would like to offer as an alternative to the assessment. There's no approval that OSPI needs to provide for a locally determined course. In the bill, it actually does say that OSPI does need to approve the locally administered assessments. There's a lot of complexities around this, and so we are continuing to grapple with the logistics and what that would look like in terms of guidance. So we will have information, we're hoping by the end of January, much more around the locally determined courses. Will the new third credit be accepted by four-year colleges for the third year? That's a good question, and that was something that we will have the work group do some inquiry into, and if it would be accepted as a quantitative, course. It certainly will not meet an Algebra 2 requirement, so any institution that requires Algebra 2, it would not meet that requirement. All right, is there a way to get involved with the planning of the new third year option class? So we had an application process, and we are going to be looking for folks to be involved in some work groups. So send me an email if you are interested, and we'll, kind of first priority will be those who completed the application. The deadline was last week. So definitely send me an email. My email is on the PowerPoint. Next one. Can Algebra 2 be a locally determined course? We think we may have, sorry, things are.
Sorry. Yeah, so some other technical questions. So, yeah.
Okay, can Algebra 2 be a locally determined course? We think it may, we may have students not pass SBA, but should be able to move on Algebra 2. That again is completely, it's local control. So you guys can completely determine as a district if you want to use Algebra 2 as a locally determined course. Bridge to College questions are in a bank but aren't actually assessments. Are teachers free to choose which questions to use? Do their tests need to be approved by the state? So yes, in terms of the Bridge to College as a locally determined course and the locally administered assessments, there is an assessment bank, and that would be up to the school or the district to determine which of those questions out of the bank you would want to use for the assessment, and OSPI does not need to approve that choice. That has already been approved. We currently offer Bridge to College Math to grade 11 students and count as a third credit. Possible disconnect between your information and SBA's position. Could this not satisfy requirement be a locally determined course? So again, we work closely with State Board and Community Technical Colleges. We are strong partners and collaborators on this entire work with the Bridge to College since the initiative's inception. And our stance has always been this is really designed for a fourth year course. If schools or districts are choosing to move it to 11th grade, I will say the one area that, a few areas that you're missing is that students cannot access that placement agreement. If they take Bridge to College in 11th grade, they cannot, if they take a different course their 12th grade year, they cannot access that placement agreement. It has to be, they have to actually take and pass the course with a B in their 12th grade year. And this is one of the big reasons why we started the Bridge to College, is because it is so difficult for students to get into credit-bearing courses. And if they get into developmental courses, the likelihood of them actually finishing a degree is less than 50%. It's pretty horrific. And so this is really a way to get our students into credit-bearing courses. And this is why we've looked at developing a third credit of math as a way to deal with and really support those students. And so it could be a nice pathway into, you've got a third credit course in your 11th grade year, and then a Bridge to College course, or possibly Algebra 2 your senior year. All right, so we're going to finish up the last few slides as we're heading down the home stretch of our time here. These are alternatives to the assessment, and these are either through the bill or what's already existed. So there's an expedited appeals waiver. This is for classes 2014 through 18. If they have met all other graduation requirements, then students are able to apply for an expedited appeals waiver that will waive them from having to meet the graduation requirement around the math or the ELA test. That's the link. Those subtopics are all what will be covered on the in the web page. And then so here are some options you can read there: completion of a college level class, admission to higher education institution or career prep program, award a scholarship for higher ed, enlistment in the branch, or an other. And the other, there is going to be clear guidance around what the other would be accepted for mathematics, and that should be out very soon as well. Dual credit, so if a student completes a dual credit course in ELA math and earns credit, this can also be used as an objective alternative assessment. There'll be more information again posted on the graduation alternatives page. And finally, we have our additional assessment alternatives. These have always been in place, and just want to remind you that these are other ways that students can, ways that they can use as an alternative way to meet the assessment requirement. So there we have resources that you are, kind of links to different resources that would be helpful. And we have just a few more minutes. See if we have any other questions.
I just answered a couple of them.
Okay. Can the locally determined course be a semester, or does it have to be a full year? That's a good question.
Yeah, I think in the legislation, it says that they have to earn credit in the course.
Right. So we'll put that in our FAQ. There's a couple other question here that
can you use the same assessment for different locally determined courses? We don't know. The requirements are still being laid out. The assessment in the legislation says the assessment has to be tied to the course. Do you have courses that you would use the same assessments currently? I don't know.
Yeah, and really it's very clear in the bill that it's tied to, that the assessment is tied to a locally determined course. We will have more information at the end of January posted on the website, so continue to look particularly around those locally determined courses and locally administered assessments. This is new territory for everyone, so we're all trying to wrap our mind around this. But we really hope with looking at Bridge to College, the third credit, the possibility with, maybe COE tasks, that you will have some supports to really think about what might be possible for a locally determined course for next year for your students who are as shown on track by the end of 10th grade. All right, well, we are at the end of our time, and we want to thank you very much for sticking with us in this hour, and we hope that you have a fantastic evening. Please feel free to email Antone or myself with any other questions. Again, we will post this by the end of the week, and let us know if, you know, and we'll do a FAQ with other questions that we didn't quite get to.
Thank you very much.
All right, thanks a lot. Good night.